Today's topic is SAT and ACT, and our counselor who's speaking is Miss Pam. And Pam has a lot of experience, leader of the high school for the college admissions, and she's here to share the information with you. Go ahead, Pam.
Thank you very much. So we will be just discussing and unpacking what test optional and test blind admissions for colleges means. And I will be providing different resources and information about SAT or ACT for students who plan to pursue taking those tests. Some of those resources will include studying, like outline studying schedules and various means of test preparation. So test optional has become a new thing where schools are no longer requiring that students submit an SAT or an ACT score. A test optional admissions policy means that each student can take those tests or choose not to. And if they take the test, they can decide whether or not they feel that their scores are something that they want to add as part of their application process. It doesn't mean that schools don't want to see an applicant's test scores, but it does mean that if a student doesn't submit test scores, that it won't be held against them and it won't make their application any lesser than those who do submit test scores. There are a few variations of test optional. Schools that are test optional for all in their admissions policies are going to allow for the individual student to have the autonomy to decide if their test scores are an accurate representation of themselves and their academic successes. So you can choose to, or you can choose not to. Test optional for some colleges, if your GPA or your class rank meets the minimum requirements, you can decide not to submit scores. But some applicants, for example, folks who might be homeschooled or international students, they may be required to submit scores. Test optional for enrollment or scholarships. Some colleges that don't require you to submit your scores as part of their admission decision, they might require you to submit them later on down the line prior to moving in on campus or starting your courses. Schools who are test blind, also known as test free, are schools that are not going to look at test scores even if you submit them. These schools believe passionately that there are other parts of your application that provide more valuable information than just your test scores. Test blind and test free schools, your essays are tremendously important. Your personal statement and your supplemental essays and your personal insight questions for the UCs are definitely going to be very, very powerful components of your college application. And I think, it's just fairly recently that emphasis more so on essays than test scores has become more and more apparent. So in this test optional world, or the many schools that have become test optional, I think there's a lot of benefit to, if you are deciding to take the SAT or ACT, that you consider both and you choose the test that is the best fit for you. There are some varying factors in making that choice. So the SAT has 2 sections, math and reading and writing, and then the optional essay. Whereas the ACT has 4 sections, math, science, reading, and English, and they do also offer an optional writing section as well. Their scoring is entirely different. Each section of the SAT score ranges between 200 and 800, and the score range for the ACT is between a 1 and a 36. The way that they score these tests is also different. SAT total scores are based on a sum of the 2 section scores ranging 400 to 1600, and ACT composite scores are an average of the scores earned in each section. Section scores are based on your raw score in each section, which is the number of questions you got right for the SAT, and the ACT scores are based only on the number of questions you answered correctly. There's no penalty for guessing. A lot of students are pursuing self-studying. So I think it's really important that students and families who are pursuing taking SAT or ACT have a conversation about what that plan will look like for them. Self-studying, if you break it down, needs to focus on three main categories: the memorization, learning, and practicing. So speaking specifically to the SAT, SAT provides some geometry formulas on the test itself, but having a short list of formulas and grammar rules memorized is going to set you up for the best success. Memorization is best achieved through frequent interaction with material and repetition over time. So ensuring that you have a studying schedule and routine that is set up to best serve you and your learning habits is going to support you best through that. SAT prep is building on memorization through the implementation of content learning and learning strategy. So absorbing and really understanding and learning concepts and materials for the SAT is going to require a deeper level of engagement on these content areas that surpasses just memorizing. So again, making sure that you are setting yourself up with a studying schedule to best serve you and your learning needs. Some folks do better when they're pressed for time, so a more condensed studying schedule versus a long-term and paced routine. For practice, by pacing yourself, your test prep journey, you create space for the implementation of content knowledge and also building on your SAT testing strategy. These tests are long-winded, and a big part of how you perform kind of comes down to, you know, your ability to do well with the timing, having a stamina, and managing your time from question to question. And that's something that you can really get a grip of as you begin practicing. This is one of two SAT, or you can even use this for the ACT studying, self-studying skills routines that I have found. This is based on a 3-month tutoring and or study schedule with the expectation that students are going to spend 2.5 to 5.5 hours a week preparing. This is just an outlined overview, but the first phase is weekly 90-minute tutoring or self-studying sessions, in addition to 1 to 4 hours of SAT or ACT homework in between those 90-minute sessions. Completing at least 2 to 4 full-timed practice tests before sitting for the real exam, and pulling it all together by utilizing untimed practice tests to master the concepts and strategy, and timed practice tests to master performance, skills, and stamina. The sprint approach is based on a 6-week or less tutoring or self-studying time frame. This is particularly good for students who are close to their goal scores without preparation, and who also work best in small concentrated bursts. This is not the recommended approach for students who find that there's significant content areas that they can, you know, put some work into, or that they're seeing for the first time. For phase 1, it's the first 2 weeks. You want to make sure that you are identifying your strengths and areas of growth in the test concepts. For phase 2, which would be week 2 and 3, you want to incorporate time sessions early on, especially because this is based on a shorter stint of time. So you want to incorporate time sessions early on. You want to start timing individual passages and then gradually move on to full sections and full tests. Phase 3, which would look like week 4 and 6, is when you would start doing full practice tests and practice test reviews. I have created an outline of these study schedules that is way more detailed, but for the purpose of this presentation, that was a bit of an overview. So you can feel free to ask Dr. Sherry or myself if you're a student and you would like to see what that outline looks like. That's something that we can definitely share with you. So especially with test optional, a question that I get a lot from students is, how do I know if my score looks like one I should submit, right? So these graphics here, which are also in the little guide that I created, can help you figure out whether or not you want to submit your scores. It's really important that you are familiar with what the average accepted student who submitted scores earned on their testing the year prior, so that you can compare where your scores are at. I recommend that students, after they take it for the first time, they give themselves the wiggle room to be able to look at their college list that they've built, and then look at the scores they got after the first time they took the test, and then be able to see and set specific goals for what they want their scores to look like for when they take it a second or maybe third time. Available online, there's a lot of really great and helpful free resources and practice tests. Here I've listed a couple of the resources that I have found for the SAT and the ACT. There are free practice tests, and there's also asynchronous test prep and parent workshops and student classes that are held virtually, that your scholar and students, you all can find on the internet. And all this information was found on the College Board's website and the ACT's website. And they're really helpful resources. I also recommend to my students, it sounds kind of silly, but the ACT and College Board has Instagram accounts, and they both accounts post really helpful information. I know the ACT will post a question of the day on Instagram. The SAT will post reminders about registration, and they both post things like test taking tips. And in today's world, when our young people are constantly scrolling on Instagram, I find it really helpful, and the students have found it helpful to have that coming up in their feed, so that they are, normalizing seeing content of that nature on a regular basis. And they also share a lot of really helpful resources that they might not catch otherwise. Okay, does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Pam. That's really informational. And we're open to questions. So for anyone who has questions, if you are panelist, you can just unmute yourself and just ask questions. So I know Yamit has a question. So go ahead, Yamit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wu. So, Ms. Romero, I have a question for you regarding my son. He got a really high score in SAT. I'm not quite sure why I even went for it, since it appears that no colleges these days actually look at them, but he still went for it. He got 1530, which is a pretty high score. And I'm wondering, what good is that? I mean, if you can really apply with it, so what's the purpose of it, really? I'm confused.
I hear you. I totally hear you. So as long as he's not applying to colleges that are test blind or test free, they'll still look at them. It's the test blind schools that won't look at them if you submit them. And the other schools will look at them. It just won't make or break it for a student who maybe is not as strong with test taking. So as long as, he scored really well, so I imagine that those scores will align with schools that he's applying to and their average, then he should definitely submit them. It's just the test blind schools that won't look at them. Another thing is that they offer scholarships with like the PSAT scores. So that's definitely a perk to still applying yourself and doing your best for taking things like that.
Got it. Is there a slide that you had, I'm sorry if I missed it, where you showed the colleges that actually do accept either one, the SAT or SAT?
So I don't have a slide that just lists schools that accept or don't accept necessarily. Okay. But this slide here does share, comparing your competitive score to figure out, if your score is one that fits within the band of their average accepted student. But when your student is building their college list, those are factors that I usually ask my students to identify once they're finalizing their list, is what the average SAT score is, and are they accepting or not accepting scores. That way, no student, if they're all test blind schools, is not wasting their time, preparing for the SAT, and none of their schools will look at it.
Got it. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah, so a very good question. Let me add a few things here, according to what I know. So there are a lot of private schools. They still choose to look at the SAT, ACT scores. And that's basically the rule of if you want to submit your SAT or ACT. If the school lists those tests as optional, but you got really good score you are proud about, so you want to send your scores in, that will help you. Another useful way of using your high score is actually that will help you with scholarship as well. The school say you have a higher SAT, ACT scores, they tend to, if they have a scholarship based on that, they tend to give you that scholarship. They know you are a diligent student doing great job there. And don't feel bad because some schools, a lot of private schools still require SAT, ACT scores. And for example, MIT, they require, they treat it as the requirement. I think a lot of other schools too.
Yeah, there are still a really good amount of schools that do require it. And I do worry that for students who may not be strong test takers, who hear this great news that things are test optional now, and they choose not to take it at all, I do worry that if they haven't finalized their college list, that they might end up limiting themselves. Down the line, they might find a school that they absolutely love that does require the submission of a score. So I think it's definitely worth it for students to put that energy forth in taking the test and doing their best on the scores either way. That way, options can be unlimited.